My name is Hance Ellington. I'm an assistant professor of wildlife ecology here at the Range Cattle Research and Education Center. Today I want to talk about coyotes. I want to talk a little bit about our current knowledge about coyotes and an update on some of the research that our lab is doing on coyotes' behavior and species here in Florida. So, uh, Coyotes are medium-sized dog-like carnivores that occur across North America. And when I say medium-sized, I mean these animals are 25 to 40 pounds as adults. You occasionally get slightly larger animals, but here in Florida, that's a really good custom for adult coyotes. Coyotes have one litter a year. About 6 pups are born on average in the spring. Now, both parents care for the young. They are good parents, and they try to raise as many of those pups to adulthood as possible. Now, one of the reasons why coyotes do really well here in Florida and across North America is they're omnivores. So they eat both plant and animal material. Their diet's highly adaptable to the landscape that they occur in. It will shift throughout the year. They'll focus on prey and food resources that are abundant or easy to capture, and those vary throughout the year, so their diets and but also there's a lot of individual variability in coyotes, and that includes in their diets. So two coyotes living in the same landscape might specialize in different food sources and use different food in that. Now, survival is also highly variable. So depending on the landscape that coyotes are in, they will have different survival rates. In general, coyotes have higher survival rates in cities, for example, than they do in rural landscapes. And that's because there's more types of mortality in rural landscapes than cities. But in general, survival is highest among adult resident animals and lowest among juvenile transients. And we'll talk about the difference between residents and transients in a couple of slides. So coyotes were, prior to European colonization, primarily occurred in Western and Central North America. However, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a lot of land use changes occurring in Eastern North America and species assemblage changes, the loss of wolves, the loss of mountain lion throughout the East, that created conditions that allowed coyotes to begin rapidly expanding their distribution across North America. They expanded eastward and now have colonized all of Eastern North America. They're expanding southward through Central America, but past the Panama Canal, so it's just the Dorian Gap between North and South America. Dense jungle is not the best coyote habitat, but I have no doubt that coyotes are going to arrive in South America in the near future. Coyotes have breached the Arctic Circle in Canada and Alaska, particularly the Northwest, and they've crossed sea ice to reach islands that are off the Atlantic seaboard in eastern Canada, like Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island. In fact, Newfoundland will cross 90 kilometers of sea ice, perhaps attracted to seal pups that were pupping on sea ice and then colonized the island of Newfoundland. So coyotes are extremely adaptable. They can live about anywhere. And it's because they have that omnivorous diet and this really interesting space use strategy. Now, here in Florida, coyotes were first detected in the 1950s. However, rapid expansion didn't begin, particularly in the peninsula, until the 1980s. By the late 1990s, coyotes were established in all 67 counties here in Florida, including the Florida Keys, where coyotes are still seen today. So coyotes live everywhere in Florida. They live in our open landscapes, they live in our forested landscapes and the wetland landscapes, but they also live alongside us in suburban landscapes. And because coyotes live everywhere in Florida, and our lab is interested in understanding ecology, we are studying the coyotes in all sorts of different landscapes here in Florida. So we're studying them in the timberlands of the Panhandle near Tall Timbers Research Station in Tallahassee. We're studying them in the rangelands in Osceola County with the Luca Preserve. And we're studying them in urban landscapes like in Broward County with Fort Lauderdale. And we often study coyotes by capturing the animals and putting GPS collars on them, which allows us to learn a lot about coyote behavior. And we can learn coyote behavior sort of at multiple spatial scales. And we can think about at the large spatial scale, what is coyotes' behavior? What are their space use strategies that allow them to persist on the landscape? And we can subdivide these space use strategies into two main categories: resident animals and transient animals. Now, resident animals or residency is a space use strategy that we humans often use. It means that an animal is living in the same place year after year in the same area. This defined area meets all our energetic, shelter, and reproductive needs. You know, you don't, if you live here in Ona and in South Central Florida, you're not often going to North Florida to get your food, right? You live in a sort of set defined area. Resident coyotes do the same thing. So they develop a home range. Often these home ranges consist of male-female pairs, so a mated pair. They often will mate for life. And they'll raise pups year after year in that home range. So in that family group that lives in that home range, you have the mated pair, you have the juvenile pups from that year, and occasionally one or two helper coyotes that are tolerated from previous litters. So they're adult coyotes, but they're the direct offspring of the mated pair. Collectively, that group of coyotes is called a family group. It's really different from a wolf pack, which often contains multiple mated pairs that can be unrelated. Coyotes, when they live socially, are in small family groups. Now, they defend that territory against other coyotes that aren't part of that family group. So that means there's lots of coyotes that are living outside of territories, and that's transient animals. These are basically animals wandering the landscape. But because coyotes are animals and all animals have a drive to reproduce, coyotes that are transient animals wandering the landscape want to establish a territory and find a mate. That's the only way that they can reproduce. Reproduction only occurs within territories. So these transients have different strategies that they use to find a mate or to find a territory and then attract a mate. And the most common one we see is called local transients. So these are animals that are waiting and seeing. Right? They got kicked out of their parents' territory. They don't leave the area. They stick around in the neighborhood and they're scoping out neighboring territories, seeing if one of those coyotes needs a new mate, or seeing if the resources on the landscape have changed such that they can carve out their own new territory. We think that's the most common strategy that coyotes use. Now, the other strategy that coyotes use is long distance transit. So these are animals that are actively searching the landscape for a mate or a space where they can carve out a territory. These animals get kicked out of their parents' territory and they don't stick around. They immediately get up and go. And we can take a look at what these different strategies look like on a rangeland landscape here in Florida. So this is the DeLuca Preserve in Osceola County rangeland landscape. These are coyotes that we put GPS collars on and collected locations from these animals every 15 minutes. We took those locations and then we can draw a polygon around those locations that helps us define the coyote's home range, their territories. So these are all breeding animals. And you can see that these territories themselves, those 5 territories, don't really overlap all that much. There's a little bit of overlap between yellow and some of its neighboring territories, but overall, not a lot of overlap. Each of these territories were sufficient for coyotes for those pups in. Now, let's look at, and general home range size, again, can vary by the resources, but the home ranges in the rangelands here in DeLuca range from 3,000 to 5,000 acres. Now let's look at what a local transient does in the same landscape. So now we have this green coyote. Now it's not a polygon, it's the pathways of this animal. So we drawn lines to connect the coyote locations to give us estimated movement paths of this animal. And you can see, first off, this animal is using a lot larger space than the resident animals because it's actively looking around, waiting and seeing if one of these territories is going to lose a mate or if the resources change and it can carve out a space for itself. Now, you do see a little bit of overlap with its movements in some of these territories. It's sort of checking in to see if those coyotes are still there, but there is a lot of overlap with orange. And we were kind of surprised when we first saw this, but then when we look back in the records, we actually noticed that the green coyote was probably born in Orange's territory. So initially after we caught it in Orange's territory, it spent about a month there before leaving. All of these strategies right here represent about a year of data. So same 1 year time period when these animals moving in this relevant scenes. So let's zoom out, put this in a larger spatial scale. You can see the Atlantic coast of Florida there. Same 5 resident territories. Here's that local transient on the landscape. moving in between those spots. And here's what a long distance transient did during the same time period. So still a 1 year period. This coyote was collared at the DeLuca Preserve, but it didn't wait around for a territory to open up. It started actively searching. So it immediately left DeLuca. It wandered south for a while, couldn't find what it was looking for, came back up north, went into north of DeLuca in central Florida, found a spot that it thought maybe this is going to work. It's been about a month there. We don't know if it couldn't attract a mate or decided that that area wasn't sufficient to support a family, but it left it, continued going north for a while, came back, then went west over towards Lake Wells Ridge. That didn't work out for it either. Came back to the area that previous been, spent another month trying to decide if that would work, then abandoned that space as well. This animal never stopped moving. And the life of a long distance transit can be really challenging, right? So resident animals and local transient animals, they reuse space. They begin to learn their environment, which means they learn where food is, and it means they learn where risks occur, where things are dangerous. But a long distance transient often encounters something new every time. Every single day, it's in a new spot. So it has to relearn where it can find food or what's dangerous in that area. And because of that, they often make mistakes and they have a higher mortality rate than our resident animals. Now, we can also think about coyote behavior by zooming in on the individual and thinking about the activities that these animals actually do in their day-to-day life. And broadly, when we think about a coyote, what are some key patterns or key activities that we can sort of separate? We can think about a coyote resting and not moving, right? This is an animal that's resting. Maybe it's hiding from humans, because coyotes generally view humans as a predator, not as a prey. So most of the time, we're trying to hide from people. Or it could be a coyote provisioning for its cubs. But the key is it's not moving on. Now, a coyote that is foraging or hunting, that's another important activity pattern. But they often have to find a place to do those hunting and foraging things. So that's a searching activity. And then finally, a coyote that is moving from, say, its resting location or its bin site to a foraging or a hunting patch, a forest clump that it wants to hunt in, the animal is going to move directly from point A to point B to get there. And that's a traveling. And we can visualize these different behaviors with that location data that we get from the collar. Remember, it's every 15 minutes for a whole year we're monitoring these animals. And we can look at the patterns of movement in space and time, and those patterns can actually tell us what that animal is doing, what activity it is doing. So, for example, a GPS collared coyote where the dots are all stacked up on top of each other and it looks like it's barely moving at all, that's actually a coyote that is resting. Conversely, when we see a coyote that is making long distance steps and not turning very much, that's a coyote that's traveling, right? It's often following a linear corridor, like a road or a trail. It's using the most effective way to get from its resting location to a hunting patch. And it's going to make that directed movement from A to point B. Because we're often dealing with resident animals or local transient animals, they actually learn those key pathways in their landscape, and they can do this traveling behavior very effectively. So now if that animal has traveled to a location, perhaps it's in a forest patch where it previously found a rabbit, but that rabbit that it consumed last week now is no longer there. So it has to find a new rabbit. So it's searching that forest patch. It's slowing its movement down. It's turning more. It's using its nose. It's using its ears. It's trying to find a cue for that rabbit. Now imagine that it has found a scent trail of a rabbit. It's slowed its movement down even more. It's tracking that scent trail in that forest patch. It's turning more frequently. And that final behavior is what we call foraging and hunting. Now, I talked about that in the concept of consuming an animal prey, like a rabbit, but the same thing could hold for palmetto berries, right? It goes back to a patch of palmetto. It finds the good patch of ripe berries, and then it forages upon that patch. So we can apply these concepts of movement behavior and activity patterns and start to learn about what coyotes are actually doing on the landscape. So this is some work that we did in Nova Scotia, Canada, and you can see the representation of the coyote's territory with that green dashed line. And then we have those other colors representing those different activity patterns. Orange dots being resting, pink lines being foraging or hunting, and blue lines being traveling. And so with these animals in Cape Breton, we actually learned that coyotes here in this boreal forest wilderness landscape spent about a third of their time foraging and hunting. But those activities were spatially and temporally correlated with different things. So we asked the question, when does foraging behavior occur in this landscape? And traditionally, we think of coyotes as a crepuscular animal, mostly active at dawn and dusk. And we did find that foraging most frequently occurred during those periods, but coyotes were also foraging in the middle of the day and in the middle of the night. So in a wilderness type landscape where there's not very many humans, coyotes will forage during all times of day. They'll hunt in all times of day because they're not trying to hide from humans. But foraging behavior also has spatial correlates, or things that determine where coyotes are foraging. So we generally found that this varied by time of day, but there was one general strategy that coyotes tend to use. They tried to stay close, but not too close to roads and trails. Now, they definitely use roads and trails to travel, but they don't necessarily hunt the forage along the roads and trails. They hunt and forage near those roads. And this is, again, in a almost wilderness-like landscape. Now, during the day, coyotes generally preferred open areas for hunting, areas that don't have trees. But in the dawn dusk period, they move away from those open areas and begin to hunt and forage along the forest edge and avoid the open areas. They tend to prefer landscapes that have a mixture of land cover types, like forest and open and wetland. And then in the middle of the night, coyotes again are avoiding open areas, but no longer selecting based on any other sort of features in the landscape. They simply avoid open areas for hunting, but will hunt equally in forest or in forest areas. And we can take these concepts and apply it to some of our work here in Florida. So one of the students in my lab, Dakota's PhD student, he's asking questions related to coyote foraging behavior here in the rangelands and timberlands of North Florida. And he's asking questions like, does coyote foraging behavior, is it driven by wildlife availability or landscape conditions? And so the idea here is, are wildlife responding to, or are coyotes responding to wildlife abundance and currents, like where wildlife is on the landscape? Or are they responding to landscape features that might make wildlife more susceptible to coyote predation? And those are two important differences that we often think about when we're studying predators. And he's using both our collared coyotes at Deluca and the Tall Timber study site alongside wildlife monitoring stations that have cameras in their use that detect our wildlife from that image and acoustic data. And we can create maps of wildlife occurrence based on that image and acoustic data, and then ask those questions, are coyotes responding? And if we zoom in on this predator-prey response, one of my other students, Jules, is a master's student in my lab, and she's specifically looking at coyote hunting response to wild turkey. She's asking two different questions within this concept. She's first asking, do coyotes select for nesting wild turkey hens as prey? And so the idea is wild turkey hens are really susceptible to predation when they're on their nest because they nest nearly 24/7. They only get off the nest for a couple hours a day during that nesting period. So coyotes, if they encounter a wild turkey, it would be an easy prey item for them to catch. So to do this, Jules is looking at collared coyotes at the Deluca Preserve, and then we're collaborating with another wildlife faculty member, Dr. Marcus Lashley in Gainesville, who's monitoring wild turkeys at the site. And from his data, we are getting wild turkey locations and finding those nest sites, and then seeing if coyotes, our collared coyotes, are moving towards those nest sites or moving toward landscape features that other turkeys that we aren't monitoring might be using for nest sites. Now, the second question that Jules is asking is focusing on, do coyotes exhibit a predatory response to wild turkey gobbles? So first she's looking at when wild turkey hens are vulnerable. Now she's looking at when the male wild turkeys are vulnerable. So they're gobbling to attract mates and to compete against other males. Reproduction is on their mind when they're gobbling, not predation. But gobbles are a distinct sound on the landscape. Wild turkeys respond to it, humans respond to it. We know when a turkey gobbles, and we can hear that. Well, coyotes have better hearing than us, so they can hear it too. And it could be that coyotes are using those gobbling activities as cues for on the landscape for potentially finding wild turkeys that could be susceptible to predation. So with this question, again, she's using the collared animals, combining that with acoustic data, which tells us when and where turkeys are gobbling. And we combine these two data sets to see if collared coyotes move toward gobbles when they're close enough to hear them. Do they change behavior? Perhaps they're resting and then they hear a gobble. Do they get up and they start traveling towards that gobble or start searching for that turkey? So these are some of the interesting questions we're asking in rural landscapes, but we're also focused on coyote behavior and ecology in urban environments because coyotes famously are really good at living in cities. In fact, a lot of the work I'm going to show today comes from work that we've done over the last 25 years in Chicago, which is the longest running urban coyote study, one of the longest running coyote studies in North America. And it's important to acknowledge that urbanization is not uniform. There's a gradient of urbanization in most cities, where at the low end of urbanization, you have natural areas that are beginning to be surrounded by development. And then as urbanization increases, you get more suburban type landscapes where the natural areas are now golf courses and small city parks and cemeteries, getting a lot more houses. And then as you continue to increase urbanization, the housing density increases, you get more industrial properties, more commercial properties, large transportation corridors and networks, and a lot fewer green spaces and smaller green spaces. Now, coyote response to these sort of urbanization gradient, we found that it's complex. It's not just linear. It's not urbanization always bad or urbanization always good. So at high levels of urbanization, urban cores, we do find that coyotes generally view those as lower quality. They have to have larger home ranges to live there. Their home ranges are really complex. They're really, really linear. They're patchy home ranges. And the amount of time that a coyote spends resting or hiding from people increases in these highly urbanized landscapes. In suburban landscapes, however, the story is a little different. Here in suburban landscapes, home ranges are actually smaller than they are in natural fragments. And coyotes in suburban landscapes aren't spending more time resting than coyotes in natural fragments. So they're not viewing humans as the same amount of risk in the landscape, humans in a suburban landscape as in a highly urban landscape. But transients also respond to urban development differently too. So we find that coyotes that grow up in more urban territories are more likely to adopt that long distance transient behavior than the local transient. And this sort of makes sense when you think about it, right? If you're a young coyote, you just got kicked out of your parents' territory that's in the city park, and all around you are houses and shopping malls and industrial facilities. There's not a place for you to hang out in the general neighborhood and wait for an opening. You have to just get up and go and find a new spot to be. So we find that in cities, coyotes do that more often than they do in rural landscapes. And they often have to disperse or travel further before they find something that's in order. And then we can continue to zoom in and think about foraging behavior and searching behavior and traveling behavior in cities and how it might be different than how urbanization might influence it. So again, using GPS colored animals, we can ask questions about foraging. We find in cities, on average, like in Chicago, coyotes spend about a fourth of their time foraging. So less time foraging in a city than they do in a rural landscape in Canada. Now, we already said that as urbanization increases, coyotes spend more time resting and hiding from people. They also spend more time traveling. Here's two examples. So we have a coyote in a natural fragment along the edge of Chicago. It spent about 6% of its time traveling within its home range. Conversely, a coyote living in an urban poor landscape spent about 27% of its time traveling throughout its home range. So we find that traveling is also increasing. And that means if traveling is increasing and resting is increasing, inevitably foraging and searching behaviors are decreasing. However, the relationship between foraging and searching isn't defined by urbanization. We actually find that that's defined by what coyotes are actually consuming. So it's their dietary choices that drives differences in foraging or searching behaviors. So what we found is that coyotes that are consuming more anthropogenic or human-related food, so pet food, human food waste, things like that, those coyotes spend a lot more time foraging and a lot less time searching than coyotes that are consuming animal prey like deer, rabbits. And this sort of makes sense, right? Because what's true about human food? It's predictable in the landscape, both in space and time. So if a coyote learns to eat pet food, it's going to find pet food in that same place day after day, night after night. It no longer has to search for it. It simply has to directly travel to it and begin foraging and consuming that pet food. But if it's a deer fawn it's trying to find, that deer fawn it consumed last week in the forest patch is no longer there. So it has to search for that deer fawn, the next deer fawn in the forest patch. So we see that sort of differences. So urbanization drives patterns in resting and traveling behavior in cities, but dietary choices of the animals, the individual animals, drives the foraging and searching. And we also need to think about conflict in cities. So this is some of the work that Bill's done recently in Chicago. And we've been looking at den site placement of coyotes in cities. And this is important because coyotes, again, they don't view humans as prey, they view us as predators, but they will protect their pups against us and against our pet dogs. So den sites could be a point source for future conflict. So understanding where coyotes select and place those dens in an urban landscape is really important for predicting conflict and for managing conflict. So what we found was that is in urban landscapes, coyotes generally choose to place den sites in forested patches and forested landscapes and attempt to avoid developed patches and developed landscapes when possible. However, some urban configurations are such that they can't avoid those developed patches. They end up having to use developed areas for den sites because there's sufficient food for them to live there. They choose to try to reproduce. So they end up putting den sites in culverts and concrete structures or old construction piles. These are riskier landscapes for their den sites, and they might lead to more conflict because there's more people around those areas. And so this is really important for future planning of cities and green spaces. And so we again can take the ideas, the things we've learned in Chicago, and build on it when we look at coyote behavior in urbanized South Florida. So this is a study, we started it earlier this year, back in February, called 10 coyotes, put GPS collars on them throughout Broward County in the developed area of Broward County. And Broward is really interesting and highlights in another important point is each city across North America is unique. There's unique urban landforms, there's unique underlying land cover, there's unique species assemblages. And that means that coyotes are going to respond differently in different cities. So South Florida is really unique in two ways from Chicago. One, it doesn't have that same urbanization gradient. It goes development, hardline, everything, right? It doesn't gradually become less urbanized. There's a real hard line. And second, South Florida's got lots of invasive reptiles, invasive animals, like iguanas. And yes, coyotes eat iguanas. This is a picture of one of our collared coyotes carrying an iguana. So they are predating on iguanas and other invasive reptiles in South Florida. There's also way more water in South Florida than there is in a lot of other cities. There's new landscape features for coyotes. So we're exploring these concepts. So we have a couple early lessons I want to highlight from our work here. I'm going to talk about coyote removal, coyote dispersal, long distance transient behavior in South Florida, and coyote conflict. So what happens after a coyote's removed from the landscape? So here's one of our urban landscapes in Broward County. And we collared a coyote that ended up living here. And you can see this area's got some vacant lots. It's got some linear corridors, right? So this is a tree corridor that has utility lines along it. These are super highways out. And so here's what red coyote means in space, right? Vacant lots, that utility line corridor. And this is what that animal is using. This was its home range during its monitoring. Now, unfortunately for this animal, it was hit by a vehicle in April. So this animal died. It was effectively removed from the landscape. Now, what we don't see is there is another coyote just south of this coyote using that local transient, that wait and see approach, purple coyote. And what happens is 9 days later, purple coyote realizes that red coyote has been removed from the landscape. It moves in, uses the exact same space that red coyote was using, the same vacant lots, the same utility line for them. And this tells us a lot of things, right? It shows us how these space use strategies of the transient coyotes, particularly that local transient, that wait and see approach, allows them to rapidly reoccupy space after removals have occurred. So when we remove a coyote from a landscape, either because it got hit by a car or because it was a problem coyote and we needed to remove it for management reasons, we're going to get another coyote in this landscape, right? We're not going to permanently remove a coyote. The coyote's going to come back, and it's going to come back really quickly. This is just 9 days. And so we're always rolling the dice, right? Coyotes are individuals. They have different levels of boldness, different dietary choices. Remember, individual diet will vary even in the same landscape. So if red coyote is focusing on rabbits, what if purple coyote starts focusing on pet food? Now we have previously we had a non-problem coyote, and now we have a problem coyote. So we always need to be strategic about removal efforts and remove problem animals, but not do blanket removals, because you could end up removing animals that aren't causing problems, and you end up getting a problem. So what about dispersal and long distance transient behavior in the city? So here's an animal that we captured up at that yellow star in central Broward County, Fern Forest Park. So this animal was caught in Fern Forest. It lived in Fern Forest for about 2 months. It was its natal territory. Then it got picked up, and it immediately took off. Right? It didn't do the wait and see approach. It actively searched for territory, and it's moving southward. Over the next 30 days or so, it moved 25 miles straight line distance into northern Miami-Dade County. But as you can see, it's not a straight line. This animal is searching for space. It eventually found something in Miami-Dade County, and this is what it found. So let me set the scene of this landscape, right? You have houses with yards, you have some commercial and industrial properties, you have a vacant lot over here. This is a mowed grass and trees, vacant lot. You have another vacant lot here that's all completely fenced in. Again, mowed grass and trees. And then you have a health center property with a really well manicured landscape on with some tree cover. But nowhere do you have spaces that are scrubby or places that would be easy to hide in. And these are really small areas. So this animal lived in those 2 vacant lots and in the health center's green space. It's been living there for the past 6 months. That's a 13-acre home range. This animal has been living in. That's an order of magnitude smaller than we've seen anywhere else for coyotes anywhere else. So the smallest home ranges prior to us seeing this for coyotes are in Chicago and some other cities, and they're somewhere around 150 to 200 acres. This is 13 acres. Remember, rural coyote home ranges in Florida are 3,000, 5,000 acres. So really, really small. And that's not enough space for it to meet its energetic needs purely on the natural food. There's just not enough rabbits and rats in this landscape and fruit in this landscape for coyote eating. So probably this coyote is being fed either intentionally or unintentionally from human food sources, human food waste or pet food. So we've set out cameras in some of these vacant lots, try to understand a bit more of this coyote's behavior. Is it traveling with a pair, with another coyote? Is it gonna try to breed here? What's going on? What sort of prey resources is this animal finding? And so we've set these cameras out. We're gonna learn more about this animal, because this is a really interesting choice that this animal is making. And again, sort of unprecedented home range size. But of course, the life of a long distance transient isn't always easy. So this is coyote 327. We captured this coyote at that yellow triangle in southern Broward County. It immediately left the site where it was captured. That tends to tell us that this animal is already a transient when we caught it. It moved south, but you didn't find what it was looking for, then came back northward. Interestingly, it came right to the edge, right? It had the Everglades to its left, and it had urban Broward County to its right, and it said no, came back into the city. And we're starting to see some sort of anecdotal information from other urban coyote studies across the continent that seems to imply that urban coyotes may maybe more likely if you're born in an urban landscape to stay in. Now, of course, that isn't always the case. Otherwise, we would have rural coyotes on the rural landscapes and then that would have colonized cities. But it tends to be once you're in a city, you're more likely to stay in. And that's what this coyote seemed choice. Now, unfortunately, this coyote encountered the turnpike and jumped over a concrete barrier and immediately got struck by a car. And that sort of highlights that hard-like choice of being a long-distance transit. It had never crossed the turnpike in this location. It didn't know how to do that safely or when was the best time to do it. So it took a risk, it got hit. And lots of times these long-distance transients end up taking risks that they can't recover. But these long-distance transient coyotes are also the ones that keep establishing coyotes in new systems and extending them. So I want to start talking a little bit about human and coyote encounters, because ultimately urban systems are coupled human and natural systems. They're systems in which humans and natural components interact. And this is most ecosystems on the globe are coupled human natural systems. But urban systems are really strongly coupled because we have really complex human societies and cities. We have urban landforms that are unique, that don't occur in natural systems, but we still have lots of natural components and processes like predator-prey interactions and social systems. And ultimately, if we want to better manage urban ecosystems for human and wildlife, we need to understand both wildlife and human behavior. And so Melis is a PhD student that's working on urban coyotes in South Florida, and she's also looking at, in addition to coyote behavior, into coyote conflict. So this is just some summary of coyote conflict, FWC incident reports from Miami and Broward County over the last year and 9 months or so. And a lot of the calls, so these are calls that FWC receives, and someone calls in and says, I want to tell you about coyotes. A lot of those calls are, I saw a coyote, it was in my yard, it was in the area, it was in my pool, it was in the garage, in the building, I observed a den or sick coyote. Most of these occurrences are what we call coyote encounters or coyote observations. They're not necessarily negative. Now, a coyote in your pool or in your garage, that's probably a conflict issue. You don't want the animal in those locations. But seeing a coyote in your area, walking down the street, isn't necessarily a bad thing. Coyotes generally try to avoid people, so it's not often that people get to see them. So, you know, you can view that as a, wow, I got to see a really smart urban wildlife in my system. I didn't know they were living here. That's kind of interesting. Now, there are other calls, though, that are definitely conflict. These are things that could be predatory or were predatory events towards pets or other animals. So it calls, FWC receives calls about coyotes killing animals, injuring animals, threatening pets, and missing pets, and suspecting coyotes. These are conflict calls. These are the calls we're most interested in understanding where and when they occur and what drives those patterns. Now, I also want to point out that threatening humans is a category that FWC does receive a few calls on every year. Now, generally, coyotes don't view humans as prey. We're a lot bigger, right? Humans are 100, 200 pounds, and a coyote is max 40, 43 pounds, something like that. Coyotes aren't going to view humans as a prey item. They are generally going to view humans as predators. However, again, they will protect their pups against potential predatory behavior, against potential predators, which humans and our pets could be viewed as. So it's probably not incidences of coyote actually stalking a person and displaying predatory behavior, but perhaps trying to escort that human away from the inside or standing its ground when a human dog is not inside. But we don't know the specifics on either. Now, if we take this data and then start putting it on a map and looking at it spatially, we can start asking questions about what these calls and how they relate to the urban landscape. Are they close to natural areas? Are they driven by human populations? So is conflict simply greater where there's more people? Are these calls clustered in time? Are conflicts, potentially predatory conflicts, more likely to occur during the denning season or during the dispersal season in the late fall and the winter? And we have those collared coyotes in Broward County, so we can take our activity pattern method and estimate where coyotes are hunting and foraging in cities, and then see if coyote conflicts are more likely to occur where coyotes are hunted on the landscape. And with that, I want to start to wind down and talk about the best practices for reducing conflict with coyotes. It's all about reducing attractants and increasing deterrence. So you want coyotes to spend less time in your backyard and less time near you. You need to remove and secure outdoor food sources. That's what's bringing coyotes into the yards. It's pet food left out, it's food waste left out so coyotes can consume it. If you're feeding animals outdoors, bring that food in at night, right? That's going to reduce the likelihood of a coyote coming to your yard for food, getting used to being near humans, and potentially causing conflict. Second, keep cats indoors. Cats are great pets, but outdoor cats cause a lot of problems ecologically, and they are really susceptible to coyotes, right? House cats are a lot smaller than coyotes. They can be viewed as a prey item by coyotes, but coyotes also kill other carnivores, particularly carnivores that are smaller than them, because again, they're worried about their pups or they're worried about competition. So not all cats killed by coyotes are killed for consuming. They're sometimes just killed to reduce a predator or a competitor in the population. For dogs, if you're walking your dogs, particularly during dusk or dawn dusk or at nighttime, walk them on a short leash and not one of those retractable leashes. Those cause a lot of problems in general, but the main reason here is if your small dog on a long retractable leash, a coyote jumps out, you can't protect your pet if it's on that long leash, but if it's on a short leash and it's a small dog, you can pick it up, right? The coyote can't attack your dog if you're holding it in your arms. So again, if you see a coyote, you want that coyote to walk away from that encounter with you more scared of humans than it was before. So you want to do things that scare that coyote. Act big, be big, make lots of noise. FWC recommends like shaking hands, air horns, and other things. The goal ultimately is to scare that coyote, re-scare that coyote, make that coyote more scared of humans. You don't want coyotes becoming used to humans. Because once they become used to humans, then they're more likely to do things that we don't like them to do. And with that, I just want to highlight my final graduate student in my lab for one slide. He doesn't do coyote work. Christians do coyote work. A Christian does work on rodent community dynamics in South Florida sugarcane, where 3 species, the cotton rat, rice rat, and roof rat, cause over $20 million annually in damage to Florida sugarcane. And perhaps this will be a topic for future seminar, but I didn't want to make him feel left out because I was highlighting all the other field students. So with that, obviously lots of agencies and organizations that have been part of this work over the years. A big thank you to members in my lab, technicians, and my biological scientists, students in the lab that have done this work, international research scholars that have done this work over the years, and my collaborators at other universities. And so with that, if there's any time for questions, thank you. Thank you. And you can put questions in the chat too. Anyone? All right. I'll wait one moment. I don't see any coming in the chat. Are we good? Oh, we got one in the, yeah, Jason. So the question was, has there been studies where coyotes have been removed from an urban landscape and released in rural landscapes? Off the top of my head, I can't think of studies that have done this. Those sort of efforts can be expensive, and what you're probably doing when you're releasing a coyote or most animals in a new landscape that they've not been in before, you're introducing them into a landscape that already has coyotes in it, that have its own established territories. So if you had a territorial coyote and you drove it 100 miles away and dropped it off, you're dropping that off in a space that already has coyote territories. You're basically probably forcing that animal to become a transient coyote, and you don't know what it's in. It could even potentially travel all the way back. So that's why we don't really use those management strategies for coyotes, at least, to my knowledge. Translocation efforts for species that we're trying to save for conservation or reproductions are a totally different story across the landscape. I've got a question online here. All right, so question about research in Putnam County. So I'm not doing any research in Putnam County on coyotes. I'll certainly be open to it. Love studying coyotes, but not doing any work there at the moment. Red foxes. So red fox and gray fox in Florida are interesting. Particularly in the peninsula, those populations have been declining for many years. They're really patchily distributed now in Florida. We don't really know why. There's probably multiple explanatory variables for why foxes are collapsing in the peninsula. But I'm not aware of any studies right now looking at that. Another question, have you guys found similar pattern with coyote removal in urban areas as the example in urban areas? So our example in urban area, right, showed 9 days later, a coyote reoccupied a space. We see the same sort of pattern in a rural landscape. We've seen it with cameras evidence. We don't have a GPS collar example that we can put up in a map now, but we're actively searching it out through our data sets because we see lots of local transient behaviors in urban, in rural landscapes. We would expect to see a similar pattern. A lot of rural landscapes have even more sort of flux and chaos because mortality is pretty high in a rural landscape. Yep. So, and yeah, the question was related to removals on the ranch at the trapping. If you did a trapping program intensely enough, we might be able to reduce coyote population temporarily, but you would have to keep going with that in perpetuity because coyotes are always moving. Let's see if there's any other question. Not seeing any other questions, so. Oh, okay. Right, so the question was where in Osceola County we have been doing coyote research. So we're doing it at the DeLuca Reserve, which is near Utah Junction along the turnpike. This is a UF IFAS property with conservation ducks and limited. And it's one of our main research sites for in that part. But I would suspect that coyotes probably occur through coyotes. Are coyotes predators of feral pigs? Absolutely, of piglets. We see plenty of images, for example, of our camera networks of a coyote carrying off a piglet as it runs through the woods. They definitely predate the piglets. Adult pigs are a lot tougher for a coyote. Certainly, an individual coyote couldn't take an adult pig. Maybe with a large enough group, they could do that. But pigs are big, strong animals, and adult pigs are probably not that susceptible to coyotes. When we talk about predators of adult pigs, we're thinking alligators, pythons, and porcupines. Those are the sort of main predators that take in adult pigs.
Before we go, I would very much like to invite you to come back and join us on January 13th for our next Ona Highlight. For that one, we are going to have a guest presenter who is a former student of Dr. Ellington, Zachary Holmes, who is currently a PhD student with the Department of Zoology and Psychology at the University of Wyoming, and not too awfully long ago graduated from UF with his master's degree, is going to be presenting Understanding How Cattle Management Strategies Influence Vegetative Heterogeneity and Grassland avian species occupancy. So as always, whenever I send you the recording of today's Ona Highlight and a link to the PowerPoint handout of today's slides, I'll include the link to register for this next Ona Highlight. This time of year is kind of quiet. The only event that I have to share with you is the upcoming 43rd annual Cattlemen's Institute and Allied Trade Show, understanding the why behind today's decisions for tomorrow's success. That event is going to be held in Wauchula at the Civic Center there. And it is January the 15th from 8:30 to 3:30. And if you would like to attend, you should try to register before the 9th of January. The fee is $9 and lunch is included. They have a really great program. And so I hope that you are able to attend that. I'll share this flyer with you too whenever I send you this event's info. If you're not already doing so, we invite you to follow us on social media. And if you do not get our Friday e-news, just send me a quick email to the address you see on the screen, and I'll get you added so that each week you'll get a newsy email to find out about what's been happening, events that are coming up, and any kind of special things that we think you might be interested in. And so we wish that you would have a very Merry Christmas and a happy and prosperous 2026 with many blessings. And we hope to see you again in January. So best wishes and have a safe and wonderful holiday break.